Between 2022 and 2023, I crossed $300,000 working as a project manager. And I want to be clear about something up front. I didn't get there by being lucky. I didn't do it by stacking certifications, and I didn't do it by working nonstop or gaming the system. What actually made the difference was building the right foundation early on and moving intentionally into IT and tech, choosing contract work over full-time roles, and only stacking work once I could actually handle the responsibility of the first one. This video is about how to start building toward that outcome step by step so you don't make the same mistakes that keep most project managers capped for years. So before we talk about tactics and industries or contracts, we need to actually reset our expectations, because this is where most people break the whole plan without even realizing it. When people hear $300,000 in project management, their brain usually jumps to the wrong questions. They start asking things like, what certification do I need? What title do I need? What company do I need to work for? Those questions make sense, but they're pointing in the wrong direction. The first thing you need to understand is that 300K is not a normal outcome in project management. Most project managers will never get close to that number, even after long careers. And that's not because they're bad at their jobs, it's because the system itself does not hand out that kind of money by default. So if you're aiming for something that's far outside the average, you can't behave like the average and expect a different result. That doesn't mean working nonstop or being reckless. It just means understanding what actually causes income to increase at that level and what causes it to fall apart. Here's the part that most people miss. Making more money once is not the same thing as being able to keep making that money over and over again. This shows up everywhere, not just in our careers. You've probably heard of stories of people who came into money suddenly, whether through a business exit or a lottery win or some unexpected opportunity. And a lot of those people lose that money within a few years, not because money is evil or because they didn't deserve it, but because their habits, their decision-making and structure never caught up to the new level of responsibility. The same thing happens in project management careers. I've seen people land high-paying roles or contracts before they were even ready, and on paper, it looks like a big win for them. But in reality, the pressure increases immediately. Expectations are much higher. Tolerance for mistakes at that level is much lower. And weaknesses that were invisible at lower pay scales suddenly become very obvious. At 70K or at 90K, you can get away with being a little bit disorganized or unclear or reactive. But at 150K or 200K, those same behaviors get noticed quickly. And at 300K, they get you removed immediately. So when we talk about earning more, what we're really talking about is becoming the kind of person who can operate at that level without falling apart. This is not a video about shortcuts. It's not a video about hacking the system. And it's not a guarantee that you'll make $300,000. What this video is about is how to start building toward that outcome in a way that actually holds up under pressure. In practical terms, that means your income should never grow faster than your ability to deliver value. If it does, then the system self-corrects, and usually in very uncomfortable ways. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to be perfect before you move up. No one is. It also doesn't mean that you need decades of experience to get to that kind of level. What it means is that you need to deliberately build the foundation first instead of chasing money and hoping that the foundation shows up later on. Most people try to reverse that order. They aim for the money first, and they assume that they'll just figure it out once they get there. And sometimes they get away with it for a short period of time, but in the long term, it almost always fails. So the way to think about this is simple. If you want to earn at a level that most project managers never reach, you have to become someone who operates differently than most project managers, especially early on. That difference shows up in how you communicate and how you solve problems and how you manage yourself and how seriously you take your role. That's why we're starting with foundation before tactics, because once you understand this, then everything else starts to make sense. When I say build a foundation first, I want to be very clear about what I mean, because this is where people tend to mentally check out or misinterpret the advice. In project management, foundation means something very specific. It's the set of behaviors that make other people trust you with more responsibility and more complexity and eventually more money. At higher levels of pay, you're not being paid for task tracking. You're being paid to reduce chaos, to make decisions under uncertainty, and to keep moving things forward when the conditions aren't ideal. And that requires skills that don't show up on a resume the same way certifications do. So let's break this down into practical terms. The first part of the foundation is simply communication. And I don't mean being a good talker. I mean being able to explain what's going on clearly when things are messy. A strong project manager can take a confusing situation and explain it in a way that makes other people calmer. They can explain what's known and what's not known yet, what the risks are and what the next steps look like, and they don't overpromise and they don't hide problems either. At lower levels, you can kind of get away with vague updates or reactive communication. At higher levels, that gets noticed very quickly. Executives and clients don't want more noise. They want clarity. And the PM who can consistently provide that becomes more valuable over time. The second part of the foundation is problem solving. Real project management is not about following templates. It's about navigating trade-offs. You're constantly balancing scope, time, cost, quality, and people. There's almost never a perfect answer. There's usually just a least bad option given the constraints. Early in their careers, a lot of PMs freeze when things aren't clear. They wait for instructions. They hope that someone else will make the call. That's understandable, but it caps growth quickly. As you move up, what people actually want from you is judgment. They want you to assess the situation, identify options, explain the trade-offs, and recommend a path forward, even with incomplete or imperfect information. That ability is one of the biggest drivers of higher pay because it reduces decision fatigue for everyone else. The third part of the foundation is professional attitude, and this one is subtle but critical. High-paying PMs are not necessarily the smartest people in the room, but they are usually the most reliable. They do what they say they're going to do, and they follow through. They don't disappear when things get uncomfortable, and they don't need to be chased constantly. This builds trust over time, and trust is what gets you access to better projects, better clients, and eventually better rates. When someone knows that giving you responsibility makes their life easier, not harder, they start pulling you into more important work. And the fourth part of the foundation is self-management. And this becomes especially important later if you want to work remotely or you want to work on contracts, because no one is watching over your shoulder. No one is micromanaging your day-to-day. You are expected to just manage your time, your energy, and your workload without falling behind or burning out. So if you struggle with prioritization, focus, or consistency early on, those issues don't magically disappear when you start earning more. They actually get amplified, and at higher pay levels, there's less patience for that. Now, I wanna be clear about what this does not mean. It does not mean that you need to be perfect before you move up. It does not mean that you need to wait years before asking for more work or more responsibility. And it does not mean you should tolerate bad environments or poor treatment. What it does mean is that you should be deliberately building these skills early, even when the stakes are lower, so that when the stakes increase, you're ready for them. This is why some people get promoted or paid more quickly than others with similar experience. It's not always because they know more frameworks. It's because they make other people's lives and jobs easier. They reduce uncertainty, they bring structure where there was confusion, and this is why people who skip this step often struggle later on. They might land a high-paying role, but they spend most of their energy just trying to keep up instead of actually adding value. So before we talk about industries, contracts, or stacking income, you need to ask yourself an honest question. If someone doubled your responsibility tomorrow, would your current way of working hold up? Or would it crack under pressure? Building the foundation is about making sure that it holds. Once you understand the foundation you need to build as a professional, the next decision that really matters is where you apply that foundation. This is where a lot of people unintentionally cap themselves early, even if they're doing everything else right. Not all project management work is valued the same, and this has nothing to do with how hard you work or how important the work or the projects feel. It simply has to do with budgets, margins, and how companies think about spending money. If your goal is to dramatically increase your income over a few years, IT and tech are not just one option among many, they are the most logical place to start. Let me explain why. Different industries have different ceilings for project management pay. In some industries, project management is treated as overhead. It's seen as a cost that needs to be controlled. In others, it's treated as a delivery function tied directly to revenue, to growth, or risk reduction. IT and tech fall into that second category far more often than other industries. In tech environments, projects are constantly changing. Systems are being upgraded, products are being launched, platforms are being integrated, and processes are being built or being rebuilt. And that creates ongoing demand for people who can manage complexity and coordinate across teams. And because the business impact is usually very high, companies are willing to pay more for PMs who can handle that kind of responsibility. This is why you see higher contract rates and higher salaries in tech compared to areas like construction or manufacturing or internal operation roles. It's not because those jobs are easy, it's because the economics are very different. Another major reason tech matters is because of remote work. If you eventually want flexibility, geographic freedom, or the ability to scale your income beyond a single role, remote work is not a nice to have, it's a requirement. And tech environments are far more compatible with remote work than most other industries. Most tech projects lives in tools, documentations, meetings, and systems that are already digital. That makes it much easier to deliver value without being physically present. And that becomes very important later when we talk about contract work and eventually stacking contracts. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Working in tech does not mean that you need to be an engineer or be very technical. It does not mean that you need to know how to code. As a project manager, your value is not in writing code. It's in translating between technical teams and non-technical stakeholders, managing dependencies, handling risk, and keeping the delivery moving forward. You need to understand enough to ask good questions and spot issues, but you don't need to be the smartest technical person in the room. Another mistake people make is choosing industries based on interest or comfort instead of opportunity. That's understandable, especially early in a career, but if your stated goal is higher income, then market dynamics matter more than personal preference at the beginning. You can always move later, but it's much harder to break out of a low-paying industry once you've been there for years and your experience is framed completely around it. This is why starting in IT and tech early is such a big advantage. It gives you access to higher paying work and remote opportunities and a wider range of contract options as your skills develop. Tech has been paying higher rates for project management for a long time, and that's unlikely to change because the work itself keeps getting more complex and the demand is only increasing. So if you're serious about accelerating your income, this is one of those decisions where being intentional early on saves you years later. Once you're building the right foundation and your position in IT or tech, the next decision that really changes the math for your income is how you choose to work. This is where the gap between full-time roles and contract work starts to matter a lot. Most people default to a full-time employment because it feels safer, and it's because that's all you know. You get salary, you get benefits, a sense of stability, and early on, that can make a lot of sense. There's nothing wrong with starting there if you're learning and getting good experience, but if your goal is to accelerate your income, full-time roles have a structural problem that most people don't notice until many years later. Raises are slow, they're capped, and usually disconnected from how much value you're actually creating in the company. In most companies, you're looking at annual raises in the range of 3 to 5%. Even promotions often come with modest increases relative to the added responsibility. That means if you're doing excellent work, your income growth is throttled by company policy, not by your performance. Contract work operates very differently. When you work on contract, you're not being paid for loyalty or for tenure. You're being paid for delivery. Companies hire contractors to solve a problem, to move something forward or handle a surge in the work. And because of that, they're willing to pay more per hour. They're also willing to revisit pay more frequently. Instead of waiting a year for a performance review, contracts typically renew every 6 months, and every renewal is a negotiation point. That creates leverage that simply doesn't exist in most full-time roles. So let me give you a concrete example from my own experience. On one contract, I started at around $70 an hour, and then 6 months later, when the contract came for renewal, I got the rate increased to $85 an hour. That's not a small bump. That's more than 20% increase in just 6 months. Try getting that in a salaried role without switching companies entirely. It almost never happens. And the reason it worked wasn't because I demanded it aggressively or I threatened to leave. It worked because I had delivered consistently, reduced problems for the client, and made myself difficult to replace. So when renewal time came around, the rate increase made sense to them. This is an important point to understand. Companies don't pay contractors more because they're generous. They pay more because replacing a good contractor is expensive and very risky. If you're already embedded and you understand the system and things are running smoothly, paying a higher rate is often cheaper than starting over with someone new. Now, a lot of people hear this and assume contract work is chaotic or unstable. That's not necessarily true. Good contractors often have more stability than full-time employees because they're tied to the delivery, not to the internal politics. If you're doing good work, the project is funded, you're usually fine. And if a contract does end, you're not emotionally attached to a single company in the same way that a full-time employee would be. You're used to moving between contracts, between companies, and That said, contract work does require a different type of mindset. You need to think like a consultant, not like an employee. You need to be proactive, visible, and reliable. You can't hide, you can't coast, you can't assume someone else will clean things up for you. This is why the foundation we talked about earlier matters so much. If your communication is weak, if your follow-through is inconsistent, or if you struggle with self-management, contract work will expose that very quickly. But if you're solid, contract work becomes one of the fastest and most legitimate ways to increase your income in project management. It allows your pay to track to your value more quickly and more closely. And it sets you up for what comes later, which is stacking work once you're ready. So the progression here is intentional. You should move into contracts as early as possible. This is where income growth will start to speed up for you. Now, once someone hears about contracts and higher hourly rates, it's very tempting to just skip ahead and they start thinking, okay, if contracts pay more, why not just get the highest rate I can as fast as possible? Early on, your job is to maximize the quality and density of your experience. So let me explain what that means. Two people can say they both have 3 years of project management experience and be operating at completely different levels. One might have spent those 3 years working on a small, low-risk projects with limited exposure. The other might have been dealing with cross-functional teams, difficult stakeholders, unclear requirements, and real delivery pressure. On paper, those resumes can look similar, but in practice, the second person can handle far more responsibility than the other. When you move into contract work, especially in tech, you're being paid not just for time, but for judgment. Clients assume that if they're paying a higher rate, you can step into ambiguity and make things better, not worse, that you can take the workload off for them. If you haven't built that capability yet, the gap shows up really fast. This is why chasing a high rate too early is actually dangerous. If you do land a high-paying contract before you've dealt with real complexity, you don't have room to learn or make mistakes. Every mistake costs more money. Expectations are much higher, and there's less tolerance for uncertainty. That pressure is what causes a lot of people to burn out or get cut from contracts and then wonder what went wrong. The smarter approach is to be strategic about the kind of experience that you accumulate early on. In the beginning, you want projects that expose you to real problems, projects with multiple stakeholders, projects with where the requirements change, projects where things don't go exactly as planned. That's where you develop judgment, communication skills, and confidence. This doesn't mean accepting bad roles. It just means choosing roles where there is something to learn beyond updating a project plan. You want to see how decisions get made. You want to see how risk is handled in the real world. You want to see what happens when things go wrong and how they're corrected. That's the kind of exposure that compounds. It also builds credibility. And when you've been through enough real situations like that, you stop relying on theory and you just start speaking from experience. You can explain why you made certain calls, what trade-offs you considered, and what you do differently next time. That's what clients and hiring managers are listening for at higher rates. Another thing that people underestimate is how reputation works in contract environments. In full-time roles, you can sometimes blend in the background, but in contract work, your reputation forms quickly. People remember whether working with you made their lives easier or harder. That reputation follows you, especially within the same industry or network. If you consistently deliver, communicate clearly, and handle problems responsibly, you become someone that people want to bring back or recommend. That's when our opportunities start coming to you instead of you chasing them. So the sequence here matters a lot. First, build that foundation, move into IT and tech roles, take on contracts that stretch you and allow you to grow, then let your experience and reputation justify higher rates. When people skip that order, they might make more money in the short term, but they usually struggle to sustain it. And remember, the goal isn't to just get one contract. The goal is to build a career that can support higher income year after year without falling apart. That only happens when your experience is strong enough to carry the weight. Okay, so how do we actually make $300K as a project manager? Contract stacking is the point where $300,000 stops sounding theoretical and actually starts making sense mathematically. But it's also the part people misunderstand the most, so I want to be very clear and very deliberate here. Contract stacking is simply holding more than one remote contract at the same time and delivering both of them successfully. Between 2022 and 2023, this is exactly what I did. I worked on 2 full-time remote IT project management contracts that were each paying over $150,000 on their own. That's how the numbers add up. And so when I say I made $300,000 in a single year, this is what I was doing. But here's the part that matters most. This only works after you've built the foundation that we've been talking about earlier in this video. When people hear about stacking, they usually jump straight to the logistics. They ask things like, How did you manage the meetings? How did you schedule your workday? Those are valid questions, but they're not the first problem that you need to solve for. The first problem is whether you're actually good enough at your job to handle that level of responsibility. If you struggle to manage one role, stacking will expose that immediately. If your communication is sloppy, if you miss deadlines, or if you constantly feel behind, adding another contract doesn't double your income. It just doubles your stress. For stacking contracts to work, a few things have to be true. First, you need to be genuinely competent at your job. That doesn't mean being perfect. It means you understand how projects actually run, you can anticipate problems, and you don't need constant guidance to function. Second, you need trust. In remote contract work, trust builds you flexibility. If your stakeholders trust you, then they don't micromanage you. They care about outcomes, not whether you're online at a specific minute or time of day. That trust is earned through consistent delivery and clear communication. Third, you need strong time management and self-discipline. There's no manager watching your screen. There's no one reminding you to stay focused. There's no one telling you what to do. You have to structure your day intentionally and protect your attention and be honest with yourself about what you can actually handle. This is where a lot of people fail, not because they're incapable, but because they underestimate the discipline required to work remotely at a high level. Another thing to understand is that stacking doesn't mean doing twice the work in the same way. As you get more experience, you just become more efficient. You know which meetings actually matter. You know how to prepare quickly. You know to spot issues early on instead of reacting late. You know what to focus on, and that efficiency is what creates capacity. If you're still figuring things out on the fly in your first contract or your first PM role, there's no extra capacity for you. That's why stacking too early almost always ends badly. I also want to say this clearly, stacking is optional. It's not required to have a good career. But if your goal is to dramatically increase income without moving into executive roles or people management roles, it's often one of the few paths that actually work. And also, it's not permanent. Most people who stack contracts don't do it forever. They do it for a period of time. They do it intentionally to accelerate their income, to accelerate their savings or investment goals. And so the correct way to think about stacking is not as a hack, but as an advanced move. You earn the right to stack by building the foundation first. You validate the foundation through contract work, and only then do you consider adding more responsibility to your plate. When people see someone making $300,000 as a PM, they often assume that there's some secret involved. In reality, it's usually just sequence done correctly without skipping steps. Now, making $300K in project management through contract and stacking work is not about being special or being gifted, but it does require a certain way of operating. And if that doesn't match how someone wants to work, then this path is going to feel very miserable instead of motivating. So let's be clear about who this is not for and who this is for. So first, this path is not for people who are looking for shortcuts. If someone is constantly asking, what's the fastest way or what's the minimum I can do to get paid more, they're usually gonna struggle here. The reason is simple. At higher pay levels, there's very little margin for shallow work. Shortcuts show up as missed details or unclear communication or poor decisions, and those things get noticed quickly. Second, this is not for people who avoid accountability. In contract work, especially remote contract work, there's nowhere to hide. If something slips, it's very obvious. If communication breaks down, people know exactly who owns it. If you're the type of person who needs constant direction or reassurance, this environment will feel very stressful very fast. And then third, this path is not a good fit for people who need heavy supervision or structure imposed on them. When you're working contracts, no one is managing your day for you. You're expected to manage your own workload, your own time, your own priorities, without being chased. If that level of autonomy feels uncomfortable or overwhelming, it's probably a sign that more foundation needs to be built first before you move into this kind of career. And then fourth, this is not for people who value comfort over responsibility. Higher income in project management usually comes with higher expectations. You're dealing with more ambiguity, you're dealing with more stakeholders and more consequences if things go wrong. If someone wants predictable, low pressure work above all else, there's nothing wrong with that, but this particular path will feel like the wrong trade-off. And I want to be clear about why saying this out loud matters. A lot of people feel frustrated in their careers, not because they're incapable, but because they're trying to force themselves into paths that don't match how they actually want to work. That leads to burnout, it leads to resentment, it leads to constant second-guessing yourself. This video isn't about telling everyone that they should aim for $300,000. It's simply about explaining what it actually takes so people can make an informed decision. For the right person, this path can be challenging and rewarding. It gives you control over your income, flexibility, and how you work, and leverage over time. For the wrong person, it can feel exhausting and unnecessary. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, this sounds demanding, but it also sounds fair, then you're probably the kind of person who can grow in this kind of environment over time. The worst outcome is chasing a path that you don't actually want just because the number sounds impressive. So let me end this video by pulling everything together and making the next step very clear and simple for you. If you take nothing else from this video, take this. Your first goal is not or should not be to make $300,000. That number is too far away to be useful at the beginning, and when people fixate on it, they usually make worse decisions. They rush, they chase pay instead of progress, and they skip steps that come back to bite them later. The real first goal is becoming someone who is consistently reliable, structured, and credible in how they operate. That means asking yourself some honest questions. Can you explain what's going on in your projects clearly, even when things are messy? Do people trust you to follow through without being chased? Can you handle ambiguity without freezing or overreacting? Are you managing your time and workload in a way that would still hold up if responsibility increased? Simply put, do you do what you say you're going to do? These questions matter far more than your title or your certifications. Once you start thinking this way, the path forward becomes more practical. You look at your current role and ask, is this helping me build a foundation or just keeping me more comfortable? You look at your industry and you ask, is there room to grow here, or am I boxed in to a ceiling where I'm not ever going to get paid more? You look at how you're working and ask, is my income tied to time served or to value delivered? Those answers will guide your next move. For some people, that means shifting into IT or tech. For others, it means moving into contract work once they're ready. There's no single move that magically changes everything. It's a sequence, and each step only works if the one before it is solid. The reason I wanted to make this video is because too many capable people get stuck, not because they aren't working hard, but because no one ever explains how the system actually works at higher income levels. Project management can be a very well-paid career if you approach it deliberately, but it rewards structure and discipline and judgment far more than it rewards ambition alone. So don't rush the number. Focus on becoming someone who makes other people's jobs easier, who brings clarity where there's confusion, and who can be trusted with more responsibility without creating more chaos. If you build that person first, the income will follow naturally. If you enjoyed this video, give me a like and a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and also I'd like to invite you to step into our live PMO and operate like a project manager for 30 days where you can gain real hands-on IT project management experience and start building the foundation, the skills, the knowledge, and the experience to eventually step into working 1, 2, or even 3 contracts yourself. I'll see you on the next one.